Thank you. Thanks very much, Scott. I appreciate the opportunity that Bay Planning Coalition has given me and the rest of the panelists to talk about a very important issue, sea level rise due to climate change. And this panel will focus on what to do about it. I think that as you've heard from John Englander, and as other scientists have said for now more than 40 years of studies, it's happening. There's irrefutable scientific evidence that it's happening. It's just a question of how quickly and how dramatically it's going to continue to happen and what we can do to prepare for it. Now in the Bay Area, typical for California in the Bay Area, agencies like BCDC are way ahead of the curve in identifying and looking for ways to address the issue. Many of the counties in this area are also doing the same thing. Those of you who have had projects go through the CEQA process in recent years know that for shoreline projects, sea level rise is taken into account in evaluating the proposed project in the entitlement process. And there are many other public and private initiatives that are going on here, across the country, and elsewhere in the world, as you'll hear from the panelists today, to try to develop solutions, try to develop ways of adapting to what is now the inevitability of sea level rise. In fact, even Hollywood has embraced the issue, and nearly 20 years ago, with the movie Waterworld, acknowledged that this was an issue that was on the horizon, that needed to be addressed. Kevin Costner didn't make a lot of money on that blockbuster, but it certainly got people's attention. At that time, though, just 20 years ago, the critics, including Siskel and Ebert, in their reviews, referred to it as science fiction. Well, the movie industry has continued with the genre, and it's no longer science fiction. In fact, major media publications around the world have acknowledged, as recently as this week with new studies about Antarctica, the severity of the problem, the inevitability of the problem, and the need to come up with adaptive solutions. Government programs have been initiated, including, as I said, BCDC's program for adapting to rising tides, which is a collaboration with NOAA. And at the federal level, there's the United States Global Change Research Program, which is a collaborative program among 13 federal agencies. It's not as far along as BCDC, but it is there, and it is looking at the issue and acknowledging the problem. From these programs and from other public and private initiatives, a lot of different alternative strategies and solutions are being considered. They range from relatively modest proposals, such as taking into account sea level rise for strategic planning when deciding on facility siting or possible facility relocation over the decades to come, to wetlands restoration to provide increased flood control capacity, to new and improved levees and seawalls, to enhance protection of our infrastructure, including transportation systems and utility systems, and through considerably more aggressive, controversial, and dramatic proposals, such as building a safety belt around harbors to completely insulate them from sea level rise, which has actually been proposed for Boston Harbor and closing Boston Harbor with a levee for ships to come in and out, and also for San Francisco Bay across the Golden Gate. Controversial proposals, but things that need to be considered in the decades ahead. And of course, and one of our speakers will address this directly, the need to continue to look for ways to mitigate, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, to slow down and control the extent of the sea level rise which is going to occur. Now, some would say some businesses have already started strategic planning for locating facilities. Google says there's no truth to that rumor, but the fact that they are probably one of the businesses with access to more information than any of the rest of us may contribute to some of the ideas that they have on their agenda. I will introduce our very distinguished panel individually as they get up, and they will present, I think, some diverse and interesting perspectives and alternatives that they are looking at, and the companies and entities they work with are looking at to address sea level rise. I'd like to start with the head of BCDC, Larry Goldzband. Larry has been executive director of BCDC since August of 2012. He's worked previously for members of both the U.S. House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate. He was Chief Deputy Cabinet Secretary for former Governor Pete Wilson and Director of the California Department of Conservation. In private sector, he managed PG&E's charitable contributions program, and he has twice served as a BCDC commissioner for a total of almost 10 years. Under the leadership of Larry and his predecessor, Will Travis, BCDC developed the Adapting to Rising Tide program and is at the forefront of addressing sea level rise. And given BCDC's jurisdiction, which is based on the high tide levels in San Francisco Bay, I think we can expect their jurisdiction to be expanded in future years considerably. I'd like to introduce and welcome to the podium Larry Goldzband.
There we go. Thank you, Chris. All right, so let's see if this stuff works. Let's see. L2. That's it. All right. So I speak to you, I think, as one of 4 people in the entirety of the United States who actually saw Waterworld and paid $6 to do so. And because none of you saw, how many of you saw Waterworld? Really, be honest. My gosh. So that's half the people who actually saw Waterworld. If you will remember, the big deal about Waterworld was not the fact that Kevin Costner used his own urine to create water, but instead was the last scene. Who remembers the last scene of Waterworld? Dennis Hopper has been vanquished as the bad guy. The camera pans out, and you see that his base of operations, that big tanker, was the Exxon Valdez. So I always start my comments with this picture. Who are these women? Who can name the 3 women besides John Briscoe? These are the 3 women, of course, who founded Save the Bay. But because we're at the Decision Makers Conference, I thought it was really important that I add another picture. This is the picture after, I believe, John, the first meeting of the Bay Planning Coalition. There are 2 women in this picture. The one on the right is Ellen Jonk. You see John being very sartorially splendid in the middle. But this was taken, I gather, in 1981, if I remember correctly from John's note. And I just want to congratulate the Bay Planning Coalition for really stepping up and over the past, 30 years, and really recognizing and helping us recognize the economic importance of the Bay. With that being said, there's the next one. You've all seen it. Now we can go to what's really important. I am the bearer of bad news. Sea level rise isn't coming, it's here. You know that. 55 inches, it fundamentally alters the way we will live. You know that. But the thing that really makes me think is that a PG&E senior leader in transmission who was talking with commissioners once said, this is a slow-moving emergency. And the problem, or the challenge with a slow-moving emergency, is that the public, and many times because the public officials, don't necessarily have the ability to respond to it in a way that we would think they should actually respond. And that's because it's really hard, as Zach Wasserman, my boss, said, to get the public really educated about this. For example, it took 24 years for the Bay Area to build a bridge after Loma Prieta. How many of you saw what happened in Loma Prieta? Right, raise your hands, come on. How many of you saw what happened in Loma Prieta? How many of you have seen the Bay rise? That's the difficulty we see. Because we don't really know how to communicate all this stuff we've heard today to the public. How can we actually create and implement a shoreline resilience plan if we can't really understand how we can demonstrate to the public not to be paralyzed by the fact that the sea level is rising, but instead to be energized by it. So we have good news, bad news, and an answer. The good news, as Chris said, is we're ahead of the game. But the bad news is we're ahead of the game. We don't have anybody really to copy. So the answer is, because it's less expensive to plan and plan for a foreseen event than recover, let's spend the money now. Let's build the plane as we fly it. So here's how we're going to meet the big challenge. Number one, we're going to adapt. We're pretty good at mitigating, and we're getting better at mitigating. It won't solve the problem, but it's a lot harder to adapt. And that's why we made sure that when we looked at the strategic plan and created the strategic plan for BCDC, we changed the mission of BCDC. We added 2 words. We basically said that the purpose of BCDC is to ensure the responsible and productive use of the bay. Because BCDC is going to be faced with a real challenge. We're going to be asked to fill the bay. Mind you, with wetlands, with a lot of other things that are very good for the Bay Area. But we're going to have to wrap our minds around the fact that we were created almost 50 years ago not to fill the bay, but to minimize fill in the bay. That's why our Commissioner Working Group, as Zach said, is working hard at trying to figure out where we're going to go. And of course, we have to work with all sorts of other folks, the Joint Policy Committee, BCD, ABAG, the Coastal Conservancy, the Bay Planning Coalition, and so on, to try to figure out where we're going to go. But let me now say something that I really think is really, really important and is not necessarily always seen as BCDC's or in BCDC's bailiwick. As we develop a regional strategy in SB 1184, tell your assembly members and senators to vote for it. As we develop a regional strategy, we have to be concerned with something that BCDC historically hasn't really dealt with vocally or overtly. And that is that we have to create a Pareto optimal solution for the Bay. In economic terms, or in English for that economic term, it means we can't disadvantage anybody as we go forward. And it also means that we have to make sure that the underserved communities, the communities of color, the economically disadvantaged communities who are right near the Bay are treated with respect. And we have to make sure that we do not disadvantage East Palo Alto, West Oakland, Alviso in any way that does not that actually hinders progress and the quality of life in the Bay Area. That's not going to be easy. Just like it's not going to be easy developing the strategy. But we need to make sure that as we go forward in developing a regional strategy, that we do not forget those who ordinarily at BCDC tend not to be represented. And that's going to be a very, very difficult thing to do, not because we don't want to do it, but simply we need to make sure that our outreach goes throughout the Bay Area. So, in conclusion, you've heard from John Englander today, you've heard from my boss, Zach Wasserman, today, who, by the way, is a tremendous leader for BCDC, as I think you all know. And they've all said the same thing. We have lots of work we have to do. We have lots of organizations who are doing the work. We have lots of people in those organizations doing the work. And I think ultimately what's going to end up happening is as BCDC goes forward with a regional plan with our partners, with local government, with community groups, with neighborhood groups, with communities of faith, with a lot of people who otherwise would not necessarily be involved in developing that regional strategy. Not from the top down, but from the bottom up. We're probably at some point going to get our noses bloodied. Because some people aren't going to like it. Some people are going to prefer another variation of it. And that's fine because that's the way the process works. But we also have to remember that we can't be afraid to get our noses bloodied. Because that's how we know that we're at least thinking about how to make progress. So there's a lot of potential to do that, and that's the way BCDC is going to work for the next few years. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Larry. We'll take questions at the end. So again, if you have questions, if you could note them on the note cards on your table, we'll pick them up and address them at the end. You know, every time I taxi on the runways or fly in and out of San Francisco International Airport, I'm reminded how close it is to the water level. And our next speaker is far more aware of that, I'm sure, than the rest of us. Monique Moyer is the Executive Director of the Port of San Francisco. She was appointed by Mayor Gavin Newsom and continues to serve under Mayor Edwin Lee. She is one of only 3 women who serve as port directors in the United States, and she is the longest serving director of the Port of San Francisco since the port was transferred to the City and County of San Francisco in 1969. Before serving as Port Executive Director of the Port, Monique served as the city's Director of Public Finance under Mayor Willie Braun. She has been named annually every year since 2005 as the San Francisco Business Times 150 Most Influential Women in Business, and has become permanently ever influential effective last year. It's with great pleasure that I invite Monique to the podium. Please welcome her.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. How is the acoustics? Can you hear me okay? Great. Listen, I first want to start by thanking the Bay Planning Coalition, specifically John, Ariel, and all the team, including the wonderful volunteers from the California Maritime Academy. So please join me in a round of applause for all of them. I think the speeches have been great today. I have something to say about every one of them, so I hope you've given me extra time for that, and I will be happy to comment. I also want to thank, commend Zach, who I don't see anymore, and John on your awards. Really well deserved, and we wouldn't be here without either of you, so thank you for that. So I want to start here. We were given, wow, my slides changed just a little bit, so I apologize for that, but we have considered ourselves at the port, the place where the city meets the bay, and you can see on the left side of this slide the bay in 1850. And in this picture, we are standing on Rincon Hill looking back across Yerba Buena Cove. Raise your hand if you know where Yerba Buena Cove is. Excellent. You'll see it there on the right-hand side. It's also known as the Financial District of San Francisco. So you can see that in and of itself proves our intelligence. We built the first part of our city's wealth in Yerba Buena Cove. We also then built a seawall. And interestingly enough, the port went into business because of the need for a seawall. We needed to protect ourselves from what was happening in the left-hand side there, where entrepreneurs of San Francisco, imagine that, were filling in the bay willy-nilly. And you can just see those little outlines. Those are land lots that were eventually made. And it made navigation extremely difficult. So the seawall came along to protect not the city from the bay, but rather the bay from the city. And the seawall was put out for a design competition, and it was awarded to a gentleman who became the port's first chief harbor engineer. And there are about 42 segments to the seawall. Some of them are patented and award-winning. Many of them went on to build the O'Shaughnessy Dam, and all of that occurred almost 100 years ago. So the seawall is now 100 years old. It runs for about 4 miles, and it does 2 purposes. It gives structure to the land side, the fill side, but it also gives flood protection to a significant part of the city. So this is what the city looked like once upon a time. This is where the original shorelines were. And I hope that this is going to work because the slides have gotten moved a little bit. But that's Fisherman's Wharf. You can see that's all fill. Some of you may be familiar with a street called Bay Street. Bay Street actually is in the water of the original shoreline. This is Yerba Buena Cove. Some of you may know that at its deepest point, it goes all the way back to California and Montgomery Streets. That would be the Omni Hotel. This is India Basin, 10,000 acres of fill. And of course, Mission Bay, which really was a bay, equivalent in many ways to sizable bays around the state and the world. And it went all the way back to the 280 extension. So that is where our new biotech center is. And you already know about all the other wealth that we've put along our shoreline. So back in 2009, we contracted with URS and AGS to look at what inundation would be. And they looked at the 100-year still water and added onto that some sea level rise. And they predicted 15 inches by 2050. And you can see in red what the 15 inches would affect. By 2100, they predicted 55 inches. So this is on top of, so it would be total water on top of all of the surges and other things. And you can see that the area around Mission Bay is severely impacted, as is Yerba Buena Cove and other areas of the waterfront. And we already heard a little bit earlier from John Englander about what's happening with high tides already. You saw my favorite picture in his slides a couple of times, but we already have areas along our waterfront that are low-lying enough that they are impacted by high tides. This is Mission Street and Embarcadero, also known as Pier 14. So what are we doing? First of all, we're coming together as a city. I think John showed earlier San Francisco Airport. It's all on fill as well. They are working very diligently to protect the runways and the airport the airport infrastructure. Treasure Island is an issue for San Francisco. Of course, we have a great gravity system for our water, and stormwater and wastewater. So the utilities of the PUC are at risk. You may recall that BART comes across the bay and lands in Yerba Buena Cove, and Muni starts in Yerba Buena Cove. So there's an incredible amount of city assets that we all use every day that are impacted by sea level rise. So what we're doing right now is we are in partnership with BCDC, SPUR, the San Francisco Planning and Urban Research Organization, and the Dutch Knowledge, help me Brad, the Dutch Knowledge for Climate is helping us, and we're studying Mission Creek. And one of the reasons we're studying Mission Creek is because it is already in a low-level area, and we're looking at possible forms of adaptation and what those forms of adaptation could end up costing us. So you can see this is Mission Creek looking south, back towards what's there already, which is the houseboat community. There's also 2 drawbridges. There's also incredible utility infrastructure. And of course, there's adjacent development in Mission Bay and with the Seawall Lot 337 project which the Giants are looking to do. So there's been a series of design charrettes, and we're studying different ideas. One could be that we move some of the sewer infrastructure and the stormwater infrastructure to deeper water. One could be that we establish a floodgate at the mouth of Mission Bay there, of Mission Creek rather, between the ballpark, say, and Pier 48. Another could be that we design the pier improvements at Pier 48 to temporarily flood. So what I failed to mention is we already have the seawall. The seawall is at high tide, has still got another 12 to 15 inches. So given that without any storm surges, we could probably get all the way to 2050 without having to do too much, except that we would flood pretty dramatically during the high tides or the king tides, as they're called. So maybe one answer is to let that happen. When we built the new Brandon Street Wharf right across from the Delancey Street restaurant, we built it in a way that it could absorb some flooding. And maybe that's what we would continue to do. For Piers 3032, where the Warriors were going to go, they were actually going to raise the pier in order to buy longevity. And so there's a lot of different thinking that's going on in San Francisco. We haven't landed on any one thing. We're working diligently with our state and federal partners, and we're really hoping that BCDC will just solve it for us and San Francisco can just go about its business, maybe with a floodgate right at the Golden Gate. But the one thing that we're not doing is probably, one of the things we have to take care of is we have the seawall, which is seismically challenged. It could be seismically challenged. It was built over 100 years ago. As we know, the climate has changed, the earth has changed, and that's something that we're taking as a very critical path item right now. We're not looking necessarily to raise the seawall. And first and foremost, it's because there are historic pier sheds that are on top of it, and the concept of how we might do that has eluded us to date. And also because there is a demand in San Francisco to be able to, sorry about that, to be able to be attached to the water and visit the water as much as possible. There's a very sexy slogan going around in San Francisco right now. It's called No Wall on the Waterfront. It is the inverse of what our colleagues in Japan are doing, where they are actually building up tidal walls to protect themselves. And it's clear that that's not what we're going to be doing in San Francisco. I just hope it's not something that our heirs later regret that we didn't do, because Japan has learned the hard way what it's like to have that much surge coming in. So I think I'll stop there and hope that you all pay attention to this very important issue.
Thank you, Monique. We're going to shift gears a little bit from the business planning and government planning process to a little more of the science as well as the potential alternatives for addressing the problem. Jeremy Lowe is a coastal geomorphologist with Environmental Science Associates. Does anyone know or has anyone met before a coastal geomorphologist? I sure haven't. But he's got an incredibly impressive background, which I will just summarize briefly. He has more than 28 years of experience in tidal wetland restoration and sea level rise adaptation planning on the Pacific West Coast and in Europe. His work has included the design of sea defenses to reduce flood hazards in Venice, Italy, leading wetland restoration planning and design at the Bologna Wetlands in Venice, California, so both Venices, and is the author of Tidal Wetland Design Guidelines for San Francisco Bay and for the Lower Columbia Estuary. More recently, he's been working on nature-based climate change adaptation in San Francisco Bay and on the Lower Columbia River. I'd like to welcome Jeremy Lowe.
Well, thank you. And coastal geomorphologist. Coastal, well, it means by the bay, by the sea. Geomorphology, geo is the earth, morphology is the shape. So I've been studying how beaches and wetlands and estuaries change. I'm actually a senior coastal geomorphologist, which means I've just been doing it for some time. So what I would like to show you, though, is a picture of the bay. This is the bay. This is Redwood City, if you're thinking about this. This is Port of Redwood, Bear Island to the north. And it's showing how closely interacting we are between the natural and the urban parts of the bay region. The tidal areas that formerly were tidal have now been diked off. We've occupied those. We've built all sorts of infrastructure on there. We built cities. We built ports. We have offices there. We also have a lot of infrastructure in here, like major corridors for electrical transmission, for the utilities use them. We've got wastewater facilities down there, all sorts of things. And they were built there because of this large amount of flat land that we had. And it was flat because it used to be tidal. Now that was great when the bay didn't move, when the bay was staying where it was supposed to do, where those lines are, when we delimited that by levees. Now it's moving. It's moving up. We heard at lunchtime how much it's moving up. It moves up to about my knee by about 2050, and it's likely to move up to about here by about 2100. But the frightening thing about it is it doesn't stop moving. It just keeps going. And soon I'll be out of my depth. So I think what we really need to think about is not just a solution. We need to think of a vision, a plan of how we want to deal with this ongoing problem, something that's going to occupy ourselves and our future generations for a long time. Because what we really need to do is we need to balance this with the economic value, with all the effort and resources and the values that we already have in this bay, not to throw them away, not to lose them to sea level rise, but to incorporate them in there, protect them, and learn how to live with this dynamic bay. Because we have a lot of values, as alluded to earlier. Save the Bay was set up 40 years ago to restore the bay. BCDC is there to protect it. The regulatory authorities provide a great way of protecting the bay, and how can we incorporate that protection but also allow it to evolve and also to keep that economic engine of the bay working. So That's what that bay looks like. That's what Redwood City looks like. But we're going to make it disappear. No offense intended. And here it was the bay about 300-400 years ago, before Europeans came along here and made big changes. And this is a bay which you could actually, if you go to Marin by China Camp, you can actually see maybe what it used to look like. And it was connected. It was connected together from the watersheds, from the hills, down through the marshes to the mud flats. We had elements. We had large marsh plains. We had marsh plains which we restore. We spent a lot of money restoring parts of the South Bay salt ponds. This is what we're restoring, big marsh plains. They do a great job attenuating waves that go over them. As the waves cross over these marshes, all the vegetation sort of waves around, takes energy out of the wave gets smaller, and you can build a smaller levee behind because you don't need such a big levee. Everybody does it, yeah. Okay. We also have beaches. Beaches are a great way of absorbing wave energy. Beaches absorb wave energy, they evolve, they can adapt to sea level. So another piece of the jigsaw which could make changes. That's how marshes adapt to sea level rise. And at the back, we used to have marshes, but we also used to have upland areas that were connected to those marshes. So if the sea level rise was happening rapidly, then the marshes could move back. We've lost those. We built levees with steep sides in those places. We also had great connections between the channel system, between the watershed and the bay front. Sediment, fresh water used to come down from the watersheds, nourish the marshes, allow them to build up. We've lost that. We put those in canals and pipes. We put it into our taps. We flush that down the toilet, and we put it down the wastewater pipe and stick it out in the bay. We've lost those connections between the marsh and the water and the sediment, those things that could make it grow. And interestingly, we've lost our connections with the mud flats. At the end of every channel that we have the potential to create a delta. A delta, which is a large deposit of sediment as the water slows down as it enters the bay. And where it slows down, it builds up. And where it builds up, it just takes the shoreline. Could we take advantage of those pieces? Now, we're not going to go back to the historic bay. There's no way we can do that. We built Fremont on top of it. But instead, what we can do is take these elements and think about how to incorporate them into a bay which looks for the 21st century and the issues that has. So what elements do we have? Well, in the top left-hand corner there, we have it came out as turned the horizontal levee. We did a report for the Bay Institute in about 2012. We looked at all the different ways in which we valued wetlands. And one of the ways we value wetlands is for wave attenuation, how to reduce the waves before they reach the levee. And we could see that if you have a marsh in front of it, this is not rocket science, if you have a marsh in front of it, of a levee, you can build a smaller levee, and a smaller levee is a lower levee, and a lower levee is a cheaper levee. So you can have benefits immediately from having a marsh in front of it. You can get more benefits if you put a longer slope in front of the levee. Instead of having a 1-in-3 slope, instead of having a very steep slope between the marsh and the levee, if you put a longer slope in there, you can create valuable habitat that's missing from the bay. You can allow the marsh to migrate over that slope with sea level rise. So instantly there's another benefit, not just flood risk management, but now an ecosystem benefit, one we could realize immediately. And in the longer term, what we've been looking at is, well, if we have those types of slopes and we put fresh water in at the top of them, we can recreate some of the native habitats that we've lost before, because that's what the water used to come in from the watersheds. It used to go in the back of the marshes, and we used to have a freshwater, brackish, saline transition. We don't have huge amounts of fresh water, but we do have huge amounts of treated wastewater effluent. Maybe there's a nexus between the wastewater facilities, which are all on the bay, and these slopes. Maybe we can incorporate that water, that treated wastewater effluent, do some polishing of it, provide some water quality benefits, maybe some denitrification to address some of the nutrient loading issues in the bay, create better habitat, create flood risk management, and do that in a landscape which is more resilient to sea level rise. If you look at the bottom of the page, then you'll see beaches. We have these. This is actually just off Foster City. This is a shell hash beach off Foster City. We have a lot of these beaches. They're not necessarily in the right place, but the advantage of a beach is it can absorb energy in a smaller area. So if we don't have a lot of space, if we don't have all those salt ponds to restore, if we don't have those areas, maybe there's areas where we have riprap structure and we go straight into a mudflat, we could build beaches there. There's a pilot project at Rambaroo Island that's doing just that. And the other photo is San Lorenzo Delta. This is just north of the Hayward area, and there's a prime example of a delta built up, properly managed, could provide a protection for a larger area. Now, these are on the drawing board in particular. The other two have got pilot projects going for them. We're learning how they might evolve. But that one with the delta is a drawing board. But all of these things are going to stay on the drawing board unless we put them together to make a vision of what the bay could look like with these types of management. I'm not saying these are the final elements, I'm not saying those, but a discussion about what we would like to see, because once you have a vision, you can start making a plan, you can start thinking about how to incorporate these things into capital improvement programs. You can start to think about a phasing of timeline. We don't need to build for 2100 today, but we need to think about how it will be incorporated into the future. So what we're thinking about is a vision, and this is a vision for way back in 2009 we did for part of the Hayward shoreline. On the left will be the bay. On the right will be the city of Hayward. And at the top, that's where San Lorenzo Creek is. So we drew a little yellow piece out there. Yeah, why do we have a delta there? That could protect the Oro Loma Sanitary Water District. That could provide fresh water. So next south, we got Oro Loma Marsh. Why don't we put a seepage slope behind the back of that, allow it to migrate backwards with water from Oro Loma? Then you come to a bit of a problem. You have a problem, it's that big red line. The big red line is where there's a landfill. Everywhere around the bay we have a landfill. Now you don't want that changing, so you're going to protect that from erosion. That's where you would start putting beaches. That's where you would start holding the line. Then you move south, you move back into Cogswell Marsh. A great marsh exists already. Let's enhance it. Let's provide it with that upland ecotone behind it. Now these are just lines on a piece of paper. And these are just figments of our imagination at the moment. They are also illegal, unfundable, and unproven. Minor details, but they are things that to start people thinking about how we can manage the shoreline. They should start a discussion in the bay about how we're going to manage this bay. Now, obviously, for San Francisco Airport, for San Francisco, the city, and so on, we're going to build big walls. We've got a huge investment in those areas. But that's not the whole bay. There's larger parts of the bay which we own a lot of in terms of the South Bay salt ponds, in terms of the Napa salt ponds. We have the ability not just to restore, but to adapt this bay for the next century. Thanks.
Thank you, Jeremy. You know, we're fortunate to have a lot of businesses on our shorelines around San Francisco Bay, including technology companies in particular. Our next speaker is from one of the most prominent of those technology companies, Oracle, which is, as you know, directly on the shoreline of San Francisco Bay, not too far south of where we are right now. Michael Bangs is a professional engineer. He also holds a master's in business administration, and he is vice president of real estate and facilities for Oracle. He's responsible for the design, the construction, and the operation of Oracle's 6.5 million square feet of real estate portfolio in the San Francisco Bay Area. Mr. Bangs has developed and operated corporate campuses around the world, including properties in Boston, which has issues similar to those presented for us by sea level rise. Also Budapest, Dublin, Paris, London, Noida, Singapore, Tel Aviv, and here in the San Francisco Bay Area. He has more than 25 years of experience working for technology companies, including Adobe and Juniper Networks before Oracle. I would like to welcome to the podium Mike Bangs.
Thank you, everybody. You're probably wondering why is somebody from corporate America here on this thing. Well, it's partly because of my boss, Mr. Ellison, really likes the Bay, and he really likes to take his boat out there, so I think that's why I'm here. I'm not going to sit here and talk about or debate the issue of the day, the rise in sea levels. That's a given. The panelists here today, I think, have talked about that pretty well, and it's a documented event that's going to occur. What I do want to talk about is a little bit about how corporate America will react to it. We can't fix this. This is beyond us. But as publicly traded companies, we have the responsibility to be prepared to react to emergencies to ensure that we're continuing to provide shareholder value to our shareholders, to be able to serve our customers, et cetera. So my approach really is not about how do we fix this, it's how do we react to it. I'm going to start on this slide here. I've changed the order a little bit. This is a view of Oracle's properties around the world. There's 90 some odd properties around the world, and you can see several of them are along coast, so we will be impacted from sea level rise. I think that I can speak for most large publicly traded companies. We all, on a regular basis, are planning for emergencies and threats and risks, and it's just something that we have to do. But as you can see with something like this, it's something we're always looking after. This is just a look at some of the things that we at Oracle are looking at any one time. We have essentially a threat analysis center that is monitored 7/24. What I've shown up there are some possible natural disasters that we would always be watching for. But it goes beyond that. It's public unrest, it's political climate, things like that. We as a company always have to be looking out for these type of things and be prepared to react. So the next step is, what do we do when these events occur? It's pretty simple. As we're going through this all the time, we're always thinking about business continuity, always assessing the risk, always planning a response for business continuity. How can we serve our customers? How can we process orders? How can we close our financial books? How do we keep our data centers running? How do we keep our customer data safe? Now I feel I'm part of the crowd because that's happened to me too. Our supply chain. So we're always looking at those type of things. How do we really address it? We're not going to fix it in any one place, but we are going to spread the risk. As you can see from the previous slide or 2 slides ago, we're located all over the world. Chances are that we're not going to have catastrophes at all those locations at any one time. The way our Oracle deals with this is we have physical redundancy of our locations around the world. With 93 locations, we can move operations to different places, be it manufacturing, be it R&D, be it financial services. The other is we have staff redundancy. Our staff can be working from anywhere today. They don't have to be in a physical location. They can be at home, they can be in an airport, they can be on a boat. So people can be anywhere for us. So that is part of our disaster recovery plan. And finally, the last piece is really process consistency. For someone like Oracle, as large as we are, we have to be able to duplicate our activities around the world on a consistent basis. So we strive to make sure that we have policies and procedures that are repeatable across the world, function in different cultures, and function with the technologies that are available. So the bottom line is our ability to manage risk and react to issues such as sea level rise is really part of our corporate culture to be ready to react to anything. Thanks.
Thanks, Mike. Our final speaker is Danny Kennedy, who is the co-founder of Sungevity and leads the company's global business development initiatives. He also played a central role in developing the Sungevity org program, an integral part of the company's solar energy strategy that has raised over $1.5 million for nonprofit partners. Danny's worked in climate change and clean energy efforts for over 2 decades and is internationally recognized in the field on environmental issues. Prior to co-founding Sungevity, he was a campaigns manager for Greenpeace, in which he headed up Greenpeace's California Clean Energy Campaign, which contributed to California's solar initiative, the groundbreaking renewable energy program we have now here in place in our state. He serves on the board of the Solar Foundation, a global research and education organization in Washington, D.C., and Solar Mosaic, a solar crowdfunding startup in Oakland. I'd like to welcome Danny Kennedy.
Thank you. I don't actually have a deck for you to watch, so I won't be dropping that on the floor, I hope. And I just want to congratulate the organizers to have arranged for the West Antarctic ice sheet to start to collapse at the start of the week, because that really made us all, want to be here and learn what we could do about it, because they're talking about 12 feet, not 6 or not up to here, but me standing on Mike's shoulders in 100 years, in about the time that we've been in the Bay Area as white people, basically, and then others, following the indigenous community that lived here relatively comfortably in the place for a much longer time. In the same period that we've been here as America and Mexico before it, we will be experiencing something like that. Maybe not 12, maybe only 7. But it is pretty frightening to think about. And so it's really great that we're trying to collect thoughts and start to build a vision for what a resilient Bay Area could be in the face of that dramatic change. For me, resiliency is adaptation, as we've just heard a lot of speakers talk to, but it's also mitigation. It has to be one and the same, and we have to continue to hope against hope that we can slow this down, or at least make sure it doesn't go to 20 or 30 feet, which it has potential to do with the cryosphere we have on planet Earth if we keep melting that ice and putting it into the water. So there's a sort of a goal in my mind, which is that whatever sea level barriers we build, whatever adaptive strategies we learn from the natural geomorphology of the place, we also work to make sure that we're not going to worsen those trends and those problems through time. And that is actually a really exciting opportunity. So that's what I really want to dwell on, is just to offer you a glimpse that this vision we build for the Bay may not only stave off the worst of that and preserve the best of what we've got in lifestyle and business and the rest of the world that we enjoy here, but can also contribute to the solution and can demonstrate a solution for other places that are going to go through this. This room is full of some of the best brains in the world to contemplate this problem. And if we can come up with a vision that's a real plan, then that can be exported to Shanghai, which is a city across the other side of the big pond that's worse off than we are in terms of what this sea level rise will mean, or Sydney or Boston or other cities that we've talked about that are facing similar threats. If we can come up with a plan that has built into it not just the adaptation but the mitigation, all the better, because we all need to pull together on this boat in order to ensure that we don't lift all boats, as it were, with too much sea level rise. So I look for things like any foreshore developments, any barriers, any wetlands built, any new major initiatives taken around the Bay to be net zero energy at least. And I know San Leandro is considering that for their shoreline, that Brooklyn Basin is talking to us and other renewables companies about how to at least demonstrate state-of-the-art street lighting with solar and street furniture and such. And that's great, but we can also probably go further and make sure that the developments are not just net zero energy, but surplus of clean energy. So they're not dependent on the fossil fuels that are driving the melting of the ice, which is driving the sea level rise and the expansion of the water in the oceans. And we can build into all of these developments that sort of modeling so that we get better and better as this decadal shift takes place. Those are the sorts of adaptation plus mitigation initiatives I'd like to see. It's not our core business at Sungevity. We do residential solar in America, Europe, and Australia. But it's something we'd love to get behind and help. We partner, as was mentioned in my introduction, with lots of nonprofits that are very concerned about this work, and would love to bring them into this debate and fund them through our Sungevity.org program, if possible, to do more of the same, to help you with the planning and building the vision that can contribute to those solutions. But I also just want to offer that this is an economic opportunity. I don't want to be gleeful about that. It's kind of disturbing sometimes to hear the silver lining seen in this black cloud too much. But there is the chance to grow what is already a booming industry. The solar industry in America, just for your knowledge, has done a 400% growth thing since 2010 through 2014. It's one of the few industries in America that can claim that out of the Great Recession, we've been doing 30 to 40% compounded annual growth around the globe, which is a pretty remarkable statement. We employ 144,000 Americans already in the solar industry at less than 1% of electricity. So as we grow to greater numbers, like California's on track for 10% or 20% solar electricity, will be many hundreds of thousands more employees. Here in the Bay Area, we've got Sungevity down the road, right on the water at Jack London Square, 500 people. We got, we just mentioned Foster City, our big competitor that went public a year ago, 5,000 people growing to 10,000 this year. We've got one of our competitors over in San Francisco on one of these landfilled areas with hundreds of employees, just raised $150 million this morning for more growth. So it's a booming industry, and we can make it part of this adaptation and mitigation strategy for resilient responses to this threat of sea level rise. And that growth is good for the community because jobs are already a premium in this economy and this society. We don't create a lot of labor-intensive work, but one thing that could be labor-intensive is the future of energy, and energy that is also healing and restorative for the planet as we go through this cycle of climate change. That's a kind of cool thing that we could try to package up and demonstrate here in the Bay as we build this plan. And so again, I just want to thank the organizers for having the vision, to organize you all to be part of the vision, and to just make sure that we're including in it these industries. I've just come back from a clean energy ministerial in Korea, where, you know, Germany, Korea, India, the United States, Senator Ernie Moniz and others were sitting around sort of feeling okay about how things are going with climate and the response of clean energy, feeling that in the first decade of the 21st century, solar and wind have really stood up as real answers. Now the lower cost form of new electricity generation in most markets, wind is doing remarkably well, but still aware that we've got a lot of work to do. We've still got to displace a lot of dirty energy, and we've still got to replace and build new electricity additions all around the globe, and then probably take on transport for electric mobility, which we talked a lot about, as the Koreans are very interested in that. The wind industry, just as an example of how that might fit into this resiliency and adaptation to change and storms and sea level surge through sea level rise, is like a wetland or a marsh, a break for the energy that comes in off the ocean, and could be potentially something that we could use not only as a way to produce power, but if there were wind turbines and wind farms off Long Island Sound, Superstorm Sandy wouldn't have hit as hard as it did. And so those are the sorts of thinking and engineering proposals which we're going to have to go into and employ as we design this resilient Bay Area facing 5, 6, 7, 12 feet of sea level rise. So thank you for your efforts. Good luck, and please count us in. Shine on.
Thank you, Danny. Well, great presentations by all of our panelists. A real challenge, a sobering situation for sure, but some great ideas for how to plan in this, as Larry described, slow-moving emergency. On that front, I'm not sure whether we have questions from the audience, but if they could be brought up, I'd appreciate it if there are any. I had a couple of questions. One to Larry, and then the second one to Larry, as well as any other panelists who would like to address it. Larry, you talked a little bit about the Adapting to Rising Tide program, and we've talked about how innovative and important it is, one of the first such initiatives in the country, if not the world. Could you describe a little bit more what the status of the planning process is, and what kind of timeline you see going forward? And then related to that, we've heard from John Englander and others that we've got projections for what sea level rise is going to be in 2050, for what it's going to be in 2100, 6 feet, something like that, unless it starts increasing more rapidly than predicted. But that it could, in the next millennium, go to as much as 212 feet above current sea levels. So how, with those kinds of scenarios, how do you engage in long-term planning? What is long-term planning? What kind, when you develop plans for wetland enhancement and development, when you develop plans for levees and seawalls, when you develop plans for facility locations, what kind of timeline are you taking into account when you've got those kinds of predictions to look forward to?
And now for my next trick. Let me first talk about the Adapting to Rising Tides program quickly. It started, ART, as it's known, Adapting to Rising Tides, ART, started because Will Travis and Steve Goldbeck flush off the victory of getting everybody together and getting Bay Plan amendments through, all of a sudden realized that they needed another step, which is to actually figure out how BCDC could implement on really the neighborhood community level, all the way up to the regional level, the idea that people's lives are going to be changed over the next 50 to 100 years. And so they worked with NOAA and created the Adapting to Rising Tides program, which is a groundbreaking program because what it does is it takes because it's all about us, a regulatory agency which has approved the first ever regulatory program to ensure that there's vulnerability studies and so on, and puts it right in front of people who you might live right next to and ask them, what do you think about sea level rise? And before that, do you know anything about sea level rise? And before that, how do you feel? I mean, it's really as much of a planning process that is driven by how you don't scare people as it is anything else. And that's what I think BCDC's ART program and why it's been so successful. It's a collaborative, non-threatening way to have people who live next to each other, to have businesses who provide services to those people, to have local governments who provide services to those people, and regional agencies and so on, all sit down in a room and talk about how they envision the future and how they can work together to ensure that their quality of life continues to increase despite the fact that the bay is going to rise. That's why it's so groundbreaking. And let me finish it off by saying two things. Number one, the program, which stretches from Emeryville down to Union City, has grown from a pilot project to an actual program. And now what our staff is doing is working not only in that wide stretch, but concentrating on 2 or 3 different areas and really digging down deep. And there are, for example, in the Hayward area, a group of people we've been working with who have developed something like between 50 and 150 different strategies to adapt to sea level rise. That's pretty amazing. The second thing I'd say is that when Zach and I testified before the Little Hoover Commission, one of the commissioners talked about the ART program, and then she said, sort of almost in a whisper, has anybody talked about takings? And I looked at her, I said, no, because this is a collaborative process. We're not talking about expanding our jurisdiction. We're not talking about taking somebody's property. We're talking about how neighborhoods and people in neighborhoods and communities can actually work together and not be paralyzed by the vision of a rising bay. And it seems to be working.
So the second part of the question, and actually one of the audience questions was similar, but how do you engage in long-term planning when you have a prediction for 2050, a prediction for 2100, and more catastrophic predictions in the millennium ahead?
I think one of the things that John Englander and Will Travis have taught a lot of us in this room is that there are a bunch of different ways to view rising sea level, a bunch of different lenses. And one of the things that's really hard to do is view it through a prism or view it through a lens of how many feet are going to happen when. Because it's really hard for anybody to understand what 55 inches is. I mean, who here can visualize 55 inches? Unless you've got a 4'7" fourth grader like I do. I mean, it's just really hard. What we can envision is time. We can envision 3 years from now. We can envision 10 years from now. We can probably envision 30 years from now, as John says. So I think the way that the commission's going to start looking at dealing with adapting to a rising bay is, instead of necessarily only looking toward the actual physical measurement vertically, but it actually will start thinking about temporally. What can we do in this period of time? What can we do in that period of time? Because we can assume that the bay is going to rise X amount of feet in that period of time. But let's not talk about it that way. Let's talk about it temporally.
Thank you. Mike, this is directed to you, and it's somewhat related. Businesses like Oracle that are located in low-lying shoreland areas are going to be very vulnerable in the decades ahead to sea level rise. What role do you see the businesses playing in developing adaptation strategies, and are there ways, in your judgment, to remain on the shoreline in San Francisco Bay as opposed to relocating entirely to higher ground?
I don't know if I have an answer for that question, to be honest. Okay. I think the way we will react is, I don't know if we will stay. It will be as much a monetary decision as anything. Is it going to be more cost effective for us as a business to operate someplace else as it is to remain? And those decisions are how we make, from a real estate and facilities perspective, those are the decisions that I make every day. It's really as much a monetary decision as anything else.
Next question I'm going to throw out to any panelist who wants to address it. Given the inevitability of sea level rise and the urgency of addressing climate change, do you think that federal and state government should modify the NEPA and CEQA process to streamline the permitting and entitlement of sea level of projects that will mitigate sea level rise or mitigate climate change, have some sort of an exemption similar, for example, to the renewable energy project categorical exemption adopted for 404 permitting, for example, recently, so that we can get these projects built on a much shorter time frame. Anyone want to address that?
Only if they modify CEQA for everything else.
Don't be shy.
I'll just step into the fray because we were talking about CEQA during lunch, a few of us, and one of the things that BCDC regularly finds itself in is being on the tail end of the CEQA process, because our commissioners cannot vote for a permit or you consider a permit without all the environmental documents being done, and it's getting harder and harder and harder to get those done in the time period in which the applicant, and much less BCDC, needs to get them done. But I agree with Mike. BCDC would be more than happy to talk with folks about what kind of CEQA changes might be necessary. But I would argue that any discussion like that would involve not only folks like Save the Bay and the Nature Conservancy, but the Bay Planning Commission, because it seems to me that everybody is affected by what those changes would be.
Anyone else? Okay, we'll move on. We've talked about improving and expanding wetlands for protection of tidal influence for protection and capacity increase for surge protection. What about deepening existing channels within San Francisco Bay? Would that provide some additional mitigation against sea level rise?
Sorry, what was that last? The deepening?
Deepening existing channels.
Deepening.
In other words,
existing
dredging. Deeper channels.
So one thing to look at is the wetlands obviously provide a service at the location where they are. So in front of the levee, they can knock down the waves. Another way to look at attenuating some of the impacts of flooding, of sea level rise, is to think about the estuary shape as a whole. And that's something we haven't really done here in San Francisco Bay, but it's been done elsewhere, is to consider what is usually like a funnel shape of the estuary, which, following levees and salt ponds and so on, we've radically adapted it. But by narrowing the estuary shape, you can increase the height of the wave that travels down the tidal wave. And there is some benefit from strategic locating restorations in certain areas, which will reduce the height of that wave. And the same can be said for doing strategic deepening as well, or strategic changes to the bathymetry. I don't know of anybody who's actually done that type of analysis in the bay, but I think at this point it's worth looking at, because it will provide, again, a few more decades maybe of reduced impacts of sea level rise in the bay. So at this point, it's a large scale. It's not something we've thought about particularly, but I think it is a potential idea.
Okay, thank you, Jeremy. Well, another related question, I think this goes to primarily to you, Larry, again. You're the man. What is the chance or likelihood of a multi-agency merger to streamline the process of developing solutions and to develop a more holistic adaptation strategy?
I guess it would depend on what agencies you're looking at. As far as I know, nobody's ever even talked about that. I think, however, that one of the things that BCDC is doing a lot more these days than it would have 10 years ago or 20 years ago is actually working cooperatively with those sister agencies. So instead of merging the Air District, MTC, ABAG, and BCDC, we would argue put us in the same building, have our planners sit next to their planners, have our attorneys sit next to their attorneys, and make sure that as you all go through the permitting process, that because we can actually work together a whole lot easier, and because, candidly, proximity makes life a whole lot better in terms of innovation and so on, it would really be helpful for you all if we were in the same building and we were sitting on the same floors in an open seating plan, and having Joe Leclerc, our chief planner, literally be right next door to Miriam from ABAG and so on and so forth. And I think that would actually work. And so that's as close as I'm coming to any kind of merger or jurisdictional issue.
Mike, another one for you. This is extremely complimentary. So Oracle has clearly developed a corporate culture that embeds 24/7 preparedness into business operations. How can this level of preparedness be transferred to public agencies and jurisdictions that need to address the kinds of issues we're talking about today?
I'm not sure I'm the right guy to do that, but I think if you look around your communities, a lot of communities have already got emergency response plans in place, community response plans. I don't think that this issue is the impetus for this. I think these plannings are taking place as we speak. Our role in this as a corporation, we participate on a regular basis. We do actual disaster recovery drills. During those disaster recovery drills, we engage with local jurisdictions so that we can foster cooperation with them. We don't get down to the individual levels, but we do try to work with local jurisdictions and authorities on disaster recovery.
Larry, we talked a moment ago about more generally streamlining the entitlement process for projects intended to mitigate sea level rise or climate change. What about the BCDC permitting process? Do you see that being streamlined for these kinds of projects going forward, just at BCDC alone?
I think the answer my boss would like me to give, and I think it's exactly the right answer, is if somebody has a good idea about how BCDC can refine its processes while ensuring the safe, responsible, and productive use of the Bay, I am all ears. And I would argue that our staff is all ears, because one of the things that our staff has prided itself on has been its ability to respond to different types of challenges. And I must admit, I was really sitting over there smiling a little bit when Rick Welts was over there this morning talking about how BCDC staff actually helped their project. So if y'all got an idea, I'm on the website, and if you call my my landline, you'll actually get my cell phone number too. So I'm more than happy to talk to anybody about it.
I think that's a perfect note to end the questions, and I've run out at this point. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes.
So what I would comment is in line with what Mike was saying, and also with what Larry was saying on the concept of a potential merger. So the Port of San Francisco reports to 24 regulatory agencies, and we have a problem in that oftentimes the regulations don't line up, and if they do line up, they're vague enough that they get down to a staff person who interprets them, and maybe the current staff person is interpreting different than the last staff person. So what strikes me as pretty critical, we've seen it in first responses, we saw it sadly in the folks that were able to get out of the World Trade Center alive, is the culture of preparedness, and that needs to permeate all the way down an organization. And so this is an endorsement for John Englander's idea earlier of coming back and doing a more thorough workshop. The port would be happy to host it, and asking all of you to please send those folks that this affects every single day. In my shop, it's not me that is working on this every single day. I have 5, 6, 7, 8 people who are, and we have to be of a like mind. We have to share a sense of urgency and of interpretation, and so that would be my pitch.
Thank you.
To get Larry off the hook.
Thank you very much, Monique. Perfect. Perfect point. Anyone else? Any other questions from the audience? All right, well, thank you very much to all the panelists. We really appreciate all of your points. Very well stated.